you talk about how common it is, I guess, for comedy to come from tragedy, and you used one example of, was it Elliot Schoenman?
Yeah.
Who reenacted, he and his sister reenacted the ride, that cab ride, to his father's suicide. So how common is this, and why do we use humor to cover up for pain?
Okay, well, it's two different questions. We have to bring in the F word. Freud.
Oh.
Wrote about 3 different forms of humor, one of which was using humor to deal with painful emotions. And it's basically a coping mechanism. We actually did some research years ago where we looked at the relationship of death and humor.
I'm not part of the we. I wasn't part of that.
A colleague and I.
Oh, there you go. That's better.
A real colleague.
Yeah.
A psychologist, a scholar. You know, she was a death and dying expert. And we did this study where we collected a bunch of death jokes and then non-death jokes. And we gave them to a bunch of nurses who work around death in ICU wards and CCU wards, and asked them to rate the jokes on how funny they were. And then we asked their supervisors how well they cope with the stress of one of their patients dying. And what we found was that the ones who were better at coping were more able to see the humor in these jokes than people who weren't. You know, there are people who are really good in stressful situations of being able to see the humorous side of something. And it's a way to deal with things to not be so terrible. There was a great story that, matter of fact, that Elliot Schoenman told us about Home Improvement, that they came up with an idea for a show about cancer. And the network said, absolutely not. There's no way we're going to have a... So they asked, Tim, go in and fight for this. We want to do this show. And so reluctantly the network agreed, and it got the highest ratings of any show that they had that season. Then the network came back to the writers and said, could you write us a few more cancer episodes?
Do you have any commentary?
About why humor is often the flip, the drop, that it comes from such a dark place.
Right, a lot of comedians actually come from...
Well, I think most stand-ups are pretty unhappy people. I think that the reason, for me anyway, this is just my observation, is that I could take Hamlet, anybody could take Hamlet and flip it and do it as a comedy. Would it be any good? No, but I could do it. I mean, they're very close, really, on the scale. And comedy is much harder to write because unless it's forced, comedy is much harder to write. It's much harder to be funny. You know, not to try to be funny, but to be funny. I think that my favorite kind of writing is I'm going to mention a writer who is kind of out of favor, but he will come back, and it's Peter DeVries, who was a novelist. A lot of films were made from his books, and he did like dark and light together, and that's my favorite kind of writing. I don't like what in the business is called balls out comedy very much. I think it's kind of an example of balls out comedy would be some of Judd Apatow's early stuff. I like the kind of...
You were a big Porky's fan.
That wasn't Judd. That was...
I know that.
That was, real crap, that movie.
He takes everything so seriously.
I like I like a kind of comedy that's out of fashion now, which is social comedy. That if you look at the films of the 30s, 40s, into the early 50s, even Billy Wilder's comedies in the 60s, where like The Apartment, which is a comedy but has great drama in it, or the married couple's divorce, like The Awful Truth, or My Favorite Wife, or any, which are all dark situations but made light of. I think that takes real skill. we don't have that anymore. The closest we got to it in the last couple of years was Bridesmaids, which I think is a terrific movie. She is really a gifted writer.
So Judd Apatow was all over that movie.
You know, he executive produced it, right? But it's her script with one other person, and it's dark. It has great darkness in it, and so does this. This is 40. I like social comedy. I like comedy about people. I loved The Hangover, the first one. The second one was an embarrassment. Now they're going to make a third. But the first one, you know, the story, the history of that movie is that the studio wanted it to be 25-year-olds. They wanted to change the script. They wanted to make it 25-year-olds. And they wanted just a weekend in Vegas movie. And the writers kept saying, and the producers, but the point is they're about to be 40, and this is their last hurrah. It's not going to work, you know. And I think it's a wonderful film, and it has something to say about friendship and about. I just don't like comedies, I guess, that have absolutely nothing to say. Arthur is my favorite, the original Arthur, not the remake. Arthur is my favorite comedy of the last 25 years, 30 years. It's more like an old school comedy. Boy, I'm long-winded today. Sorry about that. You got me on a tear when you get me on things. I just wish we had more varieties of films than we do. I think that's why I like documentary, because you see varieties of that the one you just mentioned has nothing in common with the film that those two people that made the boxing movie and the one about the big studio executive. The kid stays in the picture. But you get that variety where you don't get in comedy anymore.